Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Scott Samuelson, who is a professor of philosophy at Iowa State University, also the author of a couple books. The most recent book is this one. Actually, you have another book coming out. We'll have to talk about that. It's not yet in print, but the latest book that is in print is called Rome as a Guide to the Good Life. And I have made sure to pack this away next time I travel to Rome. Also preceded by this one called 7 Ways of Looking at Pointless Suffering, which is preceded by this one, The Deepest Human Life, an introduction to philosophy for everyone. Welcome, Scott.
I'm so glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, I think you start off this book, The Deepest Human Life, with this quote from William James, which says that the deepest human life is everywhere, right? We just have to, I guess, get out and look for it and, clear away all of the pollution that's kind of getting in the way of us seeing it. And I think, as I was reading all of these books, it was clear to me, I guess it's always been kind of clear to me that philosophy is an exercise that is accessible to everybody, right? And you don't need to necessarily have access to all of the great philosophers and their work. I mean, in a sense, having access helps you and guides you and makes it easier, maybe faster. But it's something that, every human being can do if they just stop and spend some time and suspend all of the busy stuff, the busyness, the divertissement that normally occupies them. And when I was reading this book, 7 Ways of Looking at Pointless Suffering, I couldn't help but think that this is something that all of us have to kind of engage, the extent to which we want to fix suffering and face suffering. And I love how you articulated that the sciences are primarily focused with fixing suffering, and the humanities are primarily focused with facing suffering. And if we were to only do one and not the other, this would in many ways dehumanize us. So, I mean, to what extent do you think that philosophy is something that is accessible to everyone, including, I think you worked in prisons, worked with prisoners who may have never had any formal exposure?
Yeah, I certainly think that philosophy is essentially available and open to everyone. I mean, one of the things that I think first alerted me to it, if I can tell a quick story, is when I was a freshman in college, I remember I first read Plato's Apology, where Socrates makes the kind of famous claim that the unexamined life is not worth living. And I remember that we debated as a class, is that really true or not? And one of my fellow students said, do you remember those 2 twins from the Guinness Book of World Records, the 2 heaviest twins? And they were on Honda motorcycles in the picture in the Guinness Book of World Records. And he was like, they look like they're having fun. I don't know if they have examined lives, but their lives seem definitely worth living. And I can't remember how I came down on that debate at the end of the day. However, I remember vividly having this kind of sense at that time that everyone's life is profoundly deep, that everyone's life is worth examining, especially those 2 guys on their Honda motorcycles. I found that to be, particularly of interest to me. But I remember thinking like, well, we all sort of have this. And I've kind of tried to remain true to that vision, but I really do believe that philosophy is available and open to everyone. I mean, I've had kids, and I remember when they were little, as soon as their kind of brains started to kick in, they began to ask philosophical questions. So there's something about just the human mind that seems to start to wonder quite naturally. So I think there's a kind of built-in wonder in all of us, but I also think, and this goes to the suffering book, that another thing that tends to make philosophers out of everyone is suffering. There's something about suffering that kind of blows our minds. I mean, a certain amount of suffering seems to makes some sense. I mean, it makes some sense that my hand, feels pain when it gets near a fire so that I protect myself. But almost everyone has experiences where someone dies prematurely, or where perhaps they suffer pain that just doesn't add up, like a migraine headache, or we look at the world and see great injustice. And it's hard not to be a human and start to ask philosophical questions in the face of that, to start to wonder what's going on here. Why is this happening? Sometimes why me? And as I've had a chance to teach a really wide variety of people over the years, I found that without exception, people feel these questions quite deeply inside them. And to me, one of the beautiful things that philosophy can do is provide a space that kind of dignifies that part of us that is asking these questions and thinking about it. And so even when philosophy can't necessarily provide all the answers to the questions, there's something powerful just about being in that space where you're facing those questions. I think I really liked how you put it, that the humanities themselves are a kind of way of facing suffering, and there's something quite powerful and meaningful just about that.
But it does seem like in today's world, right, in the modern world, we're spending so much time thinking about how to eliminate suffering. I mean, are we losing the capacity to face it? Right? I mean, is that fundamentally dehumanizing us as we sort of tip the balance of our efforts towards the fixing part and not the facing part?
I mean, my short answer is yes. I think so. I mean, it's to me, you could say a mixed blessing or a mixed curse. That there's something about modernity that is quite wonderful. I think very few of us would want to undo modernity. Maybe there are people who fantasize about it, but
no thanks to the plague. Right. I'm not interested.
Right. Exactly. That, I'm grateful for there being, Novocaine when my dentistry is being done. I'm grateful for vaccines. I'm grateful for having, pushed back smallpox, et cetera. And to me, people trying to undo that kind of stuff are wrong-headed. So and even politically, I don't want to go back to the days of feudalism or something like So in many ways, I feel like modernity took many great steps forward, and part of why it took many great steps forward was precisely the idea that we as human beings could kind of get our acts together and push back suffering, that we could rise up and challenge it and make progress against it. And indeed, like I said, I think in many ways we have, and I'm grateful for that. So that's a blessing. However, I do really worry that a certain mindset then can get locked in, which only wants to see suffering as an enemy, and it's our only relationship to it is for it to be fixed. And I think that both kind of makes our lives less meaningful, if not actually renders them sort of lost in the realm of meaning altogether. And I actually think that sometimes it can even kind of backfire and end up generating weirdly new kinds of suffering and problems, so that even by its own lights, it's not quite really working. And I do think that we're in something of that trouble with a lot of different things. I mean, I think with the question of death, there are times where we have tried too hard to sort of extend life. And by learning to face death, we could both make our lives more meaningful, and sometimes even actually make our lives longer just by not trying always to extend them. We can talk about that more if you're interested. But same way with things like anxiety. Like I think of anxiety as something that is in many ways a problem and needs to be fixed. But I actually think that if we think of it as only a problem that needs to be fixed, we've created kind of a trouble for us. There's a beautiful line by the philosopher Kierkegaard where he's like, to feel anxiety in the right way is the ultimate. That what we want is to sort of come to the right relationship to anxiety, not to just, make it go away. And I think we see this sometimes even politically in things like the war on terrorism or the war on crime or the war on drugs. Obviously, those things are bad things, and we need to confront them. But to make it a war on them where the goal is sort of just to eliminate them, seems to me to generate problems and to sort of deplete our lives of some of the meaning that we really need.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if there's an objective metric of how much suffering the world is experiencing, but I mean, it's hard to make the case that we have been, smoothly,
Right.
eliminating it. I mean, I think you quote de Tocqueville, he said that once the prospect of eliminating a suffering is made possible, right? That's when it becomes unbearable. Right? So I mean, so we now all seem to believe that suffering is optional, right? And that it's a bug and not a feature of life, and that seems to make life much more difficult for us.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, these are very practical issues, again, that people face. I think they raise profound philosophical questions, but they're just the questions that people have. I mean, like, I think of a parent with a child, in one sense, the parent wants to protect the child from suffering. But I think most parents also want to open their child to certain kinds of suffering as well. They want their kid to take risks, maybe to fall out of the tree, maybe to break the leg. You don't want the kid to be paralyzed, but you want the kid to have done some of those things. And I think many of us see what we call helicopter parenting as a kind of problem. If we're so overcautious about our relationship to our children's suffering, it actually sort of deprives them of the ability to grow as human beings. So it's to me, it's a kind of paradox that I talk about in my book, which is that we, of course, are going to kind of combat suffering in some way, shape, or form. But at the same time, it seems like we have to learn to face it and be open to it and to accept it and to see it as just a part of life rather than as a kind of a foreign invader of what it means to be human. And that when we do that, we open ourselves up to the adventure of being human. We open ourselves up to the possibilities of real growth and finding meaning. And a lot of people, when they come out the other side of difficult experiences, have a kind of weird sense that was a very valuable and important thing, even something they're grateful for, even though at the same time, it's not that they wish that it happened, but they're grateful that it has become part of their story and their life. And so when we can do that, I think we're kind of living better lives overall.
Yeah, but there's also when we hear people say things like, "Oh, it's all part of God's plan," right? Sometimes, there'll be an athlete and they'll break an ACL, and they're out for a year, and then they get interviewed and they say, "Well, it's all part of the plan." It seems it's admirable in one sense, but it's also kind of disturbing. It's like, wait a second, right? How can this be part of the plan? I mean, if it didn't happen, would you wish it to happen again? And I think you quoted some folks who said, I think it was Solzhenitsyn, who said, I would never give up that experience of the gulag for anything. Why does that sometimes, I don't know, make us that kind of attitude itself? It seems objectionable. It seems passive. It seems like kind of I don't know, self-deceptive in some way.
Yeah. I agree. I mean, it's again, this is a kind of tricky issue, but a very important one. I think, suffering is obviously a hard thing to deal with. And I think that when someone like a Solzhenitsyn can say, "Thank you, prison, for having been part of my life," that's a hard-won wisdom. I don't think any of us can win that wisdom on the cheap, and just sort of say, "Oh, well, I guess it's all, this is just as it goes. I'm getting, thrown off to the gulag. Like, it's all God's plan." I feel like that is kind of cheap, but nonetheless, there's
because he wouldn't recommend that everybody sign up for it.
No, and he opposes it. And this
right.
is the other thing is that, one of the things I try to get at my book is called 7 Ways of Looking at Pointless Suffering. And a lot of people object to that pointless suffering idea, maybe in part because they do prefer the idea that it's all part of the plan. It all has a point. I'm a little skeptical of that. While I appreciate some of the energy that wants to see meaning in suffering, for sure, I'm kind of the mind that, first of all, as human beings, we start with the perception of pointless suffering. I don't think you can be a human being and say, and look at the world, or even just look at your own self and say, yep, the suffering is just right. It all makes sense. Like, we ask why did the child have to die? Why does this good person suffer migraine headaches? Why are people like Solzhenitsyn being thrown off into the gulags? That seems to me just built into us, that we see there's more suffering than makes sense. But I also am of the mind, and so I think it poses a challenge to us, and part of the challenge is to try to make sense of it, to try to incorporate it, to try to think of a way of growing in relationship to it. And I think there's a lot to be learned from that. However, I think even after, you've done all of the hard-earned wisdom of coming to terms with suffering, I still think at the end of the day, we have to look back and say, but it's still more than I could imagine. I can't imagine, even if I die and go to heaven, I can't imagine that any explanation of God is going to make me say, like, I guess the Holocaust does kind of, work out, or for that matter, even I guess all those migraine headaches kind of worked out. There seems almost something heartless or cruel about it. And yet at the same time, that's the challenge, is that we're constantly kind of struggling against that. But I think that there will always be a kind of background of pointlessness that to be human is to live with in relationship to suffering. And so, I do think that there's a kind of cheap way of just wanting to believe that it all makes sense, that I don't think it works out in the end. And I think oftentimes it means that you haven't really done the struggle with it to begin with. And yet, like I said, there's something powerful about wanting to seek out that meaning and that plan, so to speak, in suffering.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like so many of the people who actually engage this issue are doing that, right? They're trying to find the meaning in the suffering, right? So, I mean, you talk about the Lisbon earthquake, right? And, I remember when I first read Candide way back when, and of course, I didn't know about the Lisbon earthquake and didn't realize how significant it was. But there, was it Leibniz who was making the point that, this human suffering, the moral suffering, is what, I'm sorry, let me take that back. Rephrase it. I'm going to let you phrase it better than me, right? But the idea was that, the suffering actually does have a meaning. The suffering is in the service of something, right? So whether it's redemption or whether it's justice, we all want to find some meaning in that suffering.
Yeah, the Lisbon earthquake is a really interesting event. There's a wonderful book by the philosopher Susan Neiman called Evil and Modern Thought, I think, or something like that. But she does a really good job of really showing just how much the Lisbon earthquake kind of rippled out intellectually and changed the landscape. And we're still, I think, within that kind of kind of thought world that was created afterwards. But to make a long story relatively short, I think that there had been a longstanding way of seeing evil, and in this sense, the word evil meaning something like suffering itself, or seemingly excessive suffering, evil, that evil was deeply rooted in morality, and in our human choices, and that in a sense we had brought evil on ourselves. In one version of the Christian understanding of the myth of Adam and Eve is that, we kind of brought evil into the world. The world was kind of working perfectly well, and we've introduced it into things. And in that sense, even when faced with things like terrible earthquakes or whatever, the idea is that, well, in some sense, this is God's justice that we're witnessing. But when the Lisbon earthquake hit and it killed all of these kind of just nice, hardworking people, in mass. And then when you added to that the kind of new sciences that were developing and the early modern philosophers trying to make sense of what that meant, that all of a sudden we kind of made a split where we were like, look, okay, there are things like earthquakes that this isn't about us. Like, it's not like we did something wrong and then this earthquake happened. The earthquake's happening based on, just so to speak, natural causes. It's just a thing. It's neither good nor bad, so to speak. It's a neutral event that's just happening. We don't like it, and in that sense, it's causing all sorts of terrible suffering. And then now we get modernity's idea, well, maybe our relationship to things like earthquakes shouldn't just be to repent and pray to God, but to try to figure out plate tectonics and build our cities such that you know, they're more resistant to earthquakes, and we prevent that kind of suffering. And to me, that was a very powerful idea in that regard. And I think most of us, even many religious people, you know, still have this kind of sense that things like cancer and earthquakes aren't so much God's justice, but rather just, you know, events happening on the basis of natural causes, and that gives us the kind of impetus to want to kind of, I don't know, fix them as much as we can. Yeah, so I don't know if I'm getting back to your original question or not.
Well,
but,
I mean, in today's world, I mean, the Holocaust is our Lisbon earthquake, right? And so, you know, the natural stuff we've kind of put in a box, and we say, okay, you know, with enough science, we can probably figure this stuff out. But when we look at Holocaust or Hiroshima, I mean, there, you know, we're still initially inclined to pin the blame on people. But I think we're starting to view even things like, right, Hiroshima and Holocaust as subject to some kind of scientific inquiry, and maybe if we get the tools right, we can solve that in the way that we're, you know, solving, you know, earthquake resistance in buildings.
Right. I mean, and this is, I think you're right to say the Holocaust and the dropping of the atomic bomb represented another kind of big event that also just shook our intellectual foundations, and we're still kind of reeling from. Again, to make kind of a long story maybe a little too short and simple, but you know, if the kind of impetus after the Lisbon earthquake is we will, as human beings, use science and technology to improve the world and to minimize the evil in it, all of a sudden, by the time we get to the Holocaust and the dropping of the bomb, science and technology, and even World War I before this with poison gas, but that science and technology in the hands of humans are causing maybe even worse devastation than the Lisbon earthquake, that somehow these have not been our saviors, but are potentially just as bad. And so then it raises profound questions about, so what are we doing and how should we be acting? And I think that philosophers since, post-World War II philosophers have been wrestling with that ever since. And I think we're still trying to kind of figure this out.
Well, I mean, you tell some great stories in the book about when you were reading these texts with prisoners, right? And so I was wondering, I mean, if you could talk a bit about that experience and why you thought the prison audience was particularly well suited for these discussions. And, you know, I think one of the most powerful stories was when you were reading and discussing Epictetus with these prisoners. And, you know, it became very lively, you know, just very, very, probably more lively than a typical undergraduate philosophy seminar.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And first of all, yes, I mean, talking about these issues and reading these texts with people in prison was incredibly powerful for me, and they taught me a lot. But the reason why is because they were, of course, really wrestling with these questions. Obviously, I think we all wrestle with them. For them, it was a very dramatic thing. Many of them had inflicted suffering on others. They certainly, in being incarcerated, were suffering in many ways themselves, and they were having to ask themselves very profound questions about, well, what does it really mean to confront suffering, to try to make sense of it? Is there any way to redeem it? And one of the philosophers we looked at was Epictetus, the great Stoic, and Epictetus is making these claims, in part about prison itself, and he's claiming, and it's a curious thing because Epictetus was born into slavery in the Roman Empire, and only acquired his freedom as an adult. So he grew up under, as a slave, and yet he asked these questions about, well, what does it really mean to be free, and what does it mean to, so to speak, be imprisoned or enslaved? And he makes this kind of powerful claim that at some level we have to free ourselves, that freedom is something that we can achieve internally, and that the conditions that we're in should be irrelevant, according to him, to our freedom. So on Epictetus's view, you can be a slave and be free, you can be incarcerated and be free, or you could be a master or a prison guard or the president of the United States and be a slave in some sense. Well, one of the prisoners was really offended by this idea, and he felt as if it was, not just an insult to him, but a kind of loser's philosophy, I think was one of the ways he put it. He's like, I refuse to accept that, I'm free here, and he's like, that's just for losers to think that, to sit around and believe, oh, here I am in prison, but I'm free, and so he got quite angry. But what was interesting was that many of the other prisoners, fought back against this, and saw the power of Epictetus's position. I mean, I actually think the truth is probably somewhere in between the two ideas, but it was a tremendous debate. But it ended with the prisoner who thought of it as a loser's philosophy getting so frustrated, he's like, I demand to be taken back to my cell. And the prison guards escort him off because he's so frustrated by the conversation, which some of the other prisoners, the students in the class, were, found that a bit ironic that the person who, didn't want to accept that he was incarcerated was demanding to be taken back to his cell.
Right. Yeah. Epictetus and the Stoics, they're basically saying there's no good or bad except that thinking makes it so, right? And so to what extent is that about denying the existence of suffering, and to what extent is that embracing it and fine-tuning one's existence and using suffering as a tool for that fine-tuning?
Yeah, great question. Because I actually find the Stoics to be very illuminating about the question of pointless suffering or suffering in general, and yet they can be subject to something similar to what we were just talking about. In one sense, the Stoics claim there is no pointless suffering. In one sense, they claim it is all part of the plan. And that can seem a bit cheap to many people, and even insulting perhaps to prisoners or to slaves or to people suffering. But I think the story is much more complicated for the Stoics than just simply sort of shrugging their shoulders and being like, well, just accept it. It's fine. For the Stoics, what they really believed was that what we should emphasize is virtue. That's how they thought about it, that our true happiness was in our virtue, as opposed to the kind of outcome. So they thought to think that the state of affairs was really not what you wanted for your happiness. It's not like you wanted like a nice house and plenty of money and all of that. That you could have all those things and not really have what true happiness was. What you needed was virtue. And one of the ways I talk about this idea of virtue is and the Stoics themselves compared this to athletics. And this is kind of a way of thinking about it. Like if you're an athlete, in one sense you want to win, but for the Stoic, what you really want to do is play at the highest level possible. That's virtue. And to play at the highest level possible, you actually want to open yourself up to losing and to defeat. Obviously, you're trying to win, but what you're really wanting is that upping of the game. That's the virtue part. And so when you're in that mindset, weirdly, suffering or opponents or challengers, while you still fight them, you actually have the most respect for them. That's what you want in some sense. So you want to be in a world of challenge. You want to be in a world of suffering in this regard, because it is precisely what will up your game. I think I give the example of like Larry Bird and Magic Johnson, great opponents in basketball. And after their careers were over, I heard them being interviewed, and, they were asking like, oh, you guys must have hated each other, when you were on the court. And they were like, oh, no, we didn't hate each other. Like, we had nothing but respect for each other in the court. Of course, I wanted to go out there and kick his butt every time we were playing, but it was out of respect, that we did that. And I feel like that's a very Stoic kind of mindset, to say, I want this challenge, and I embrace it. I accept it, because it is precisely where my true happiness lies. Even though that means I'm going to lose half the time or more. Another metaphor that I use in this regard is, I say that for the Stoics, I think we should be in relationship to suffering a bit like martial artists.
Yeah,
we fight, but the thing about martial artists is that they bow to their opponent at the beginning and the end. So it's done in a context of respect in that way. So to me, the Stoics give this kind of interesting way of talking about things, where they're saying we can recognize that suffering is something we oppose and are going to fight against, but we have to kind of change our mindset about what our ultimate goal is, to be, rather than getting rid of the suffering, winning, rather to be upping our game in relationship to it. So I suppose if you were truly Stoic, you would be able to get cancer and basically be like, okay, bring it on, cancer. Like, you bring your best game, I'm going to bring my best game. We see who wins. Maybe I win, maybe you win, but at the end of the day, I recognize you as a powerful opponent, that part of what's happening here is I'm being challenged as a human being, and can I rise to that challenge, and how am I going to handle myself in relationship to that challenge? That's what, for the Stoics, we should be focused on. Now, again, I don't know if I go 100% with the Stoics on this point, but I think I'd go a long way with them on this point. I think there's a lot to be learned from that way of thinking.
But I mean, one implication of that is that metaphor is that if you could wish away your opponent, you wouldn't, right? I mean, you need to have, if you're Magic, you need to have Bird. You don't want to be playing a bunch of scrubs, right? I mean, the Keatsian soul making requires that you have some struggles, that you have some tension, and yet, I mean, if we are in a position, in many ways, to eliminate a lot of the suffering. We could, again, just take a bunch of pills, be happy all the time. And it seems that, that option is kind of frightening. I mean, the fact that we might be tempted to do that.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, and I think, for one, like I said, I think it means that we can't really develop as human beings very far. But I think that even at the end of our lives, I don't know that it's such a good thing. There's a great book by the doctor and kind of thinker Atul Gawande called Being Mortal, and I can't remember if he tells it in this book or somewhere else, but he talks about dealing with patients at the end of their lives who have terminal diagnoses, and for the most part, medicine's kind of default is my fix-it way of thinking, like, just keep them alive as long as you can. You keep fighting until you give up, but what he found was that he needed to kind of make a little mental switch, and he started asking terminal patients just, well, what's a good day look like for you? And what he found was that that was a really transformative kind of question. And to put it in my kind of Stoic terms, in a sense, he was asking, what does virtue look like for you? What does it mean for you to kind of be yourself in a powerful way? Like, and, you know, people would say things like you might expect, like, I just like to have a nice dinner with my friends or whatever. He gives one example of a woman he knew who was basically hooked up to a bunch of machines, and she had been a piano teacher for her whole life. And she was like, well, what I really want to do is teach piano again, you know? And all of a sudden he was like, well, wait a second, I think we can make this happen. But now we're going to have to rethink the whole medication regime. Instead of just trying to keep her alive and out of pain, we've got to kind of allow her to feel a little bit of pain so she's mentally sharp enough to be able to teach piano, but we can adjust it so that, you know, it's not in too much pain or whatever. So he's not like giving up on the fix it side of things. He's like, we got to, but now instead of fixing it just so she lives forever, it's fix it so that she can actually teach piano again. And she, in fact, I believe ended up teaching his daughter. I hope I'm not getting that detail wrong, and gave a recital. And it was this very moving, powerful thing that she was able to do this. But one of the curious things that he finds is that when he starts asking people just what's a good day look like, and they start talking about that, and they start adjusting the medication in relationship to that, that they end up living longer than when they were simply trying to extend their lives. Now, that's obviously not the point, is to just, you know, live a good day so you can live longer. But it's a kind of astonishing thing that our focus on just keeping them alive is not only kind of hollowing out their lives of meaning, it's not even necessarily keeping them alive longer than an alternative is. So to me, that's another way of thinking of this, is that if we deprive children of the ability to be open to a certain amount of suffering and challenge, we deprive them of the ability to grow as people. But even at the end of our lives, if we deprive ourselves of the ability to do the things that we can do and to live a kind of good life as a human being, that we also are throwing away some of our humanity. So I would really love to see us start to rethink a bit here about our relationship to death and pain and suffering. Not because I'm pro-death or pro-pain, but because I actually think that when we think a different way about it, we flourish better, even if it means sometimes, we have a little more suffering, but it's for a point that we care about and believe in all of a sudden.
Well, I mean, I think John Stuart Mill came to that same realization, right? That if the best way to achieve happiness is not to seek to maximize happiness, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I have a chapter about Mill. I think he's a powerful kind of case study in modernity, so to speak. He gets raised, to really embody a kind of sense of utilitarianism and its heart, utilitarianism is the kind of moral expression of what I'm calling modernity. Utilitarianism's fundamental idea is that basically pain is bad, pleasure is good. Minimize the pain, maximize the pleasure. Life is good, death is bad, minimize the death, maximize the life. And we can judge actions on the basis of do they bring about that greater positive good, or do they minimize the negative? And while Mill never fully rejects that idea, he grows up fully believing in it, devoting his life to it, and then has a nervous breakdown and wonders, what's it all for? What even if all of my utilitarian dreams are realized, what then? And he goes through this kind of internal mental crisis, and he comes out of it on the other side. And he still holds on to something of utilitarianism, but he's like, I realize I have to change it a bit. I realize that I have to think it's not so, I can't think so crudely about just maximizing nice stuff and minimizing the nasty stuff, that there are what he calls higher pleasures that might actually involve some pain and struggle and strife, but that they themselves have a quality that should be pursued simply because they're higher. I think of like education as a good example. Education is sometimes hard and we might prefer to just have ChatGPT do it for us or something like that. That might easily, bring us to the goal that we're looking for. But we've deprived ourselves of that struggle, and hence deprived ourselves of the higher pleasure of education and thinking. So Mill comes to that. Now, again, I'm not so sure that still remains utilitarianism, honestly, when you start bringing in these higher pleasures and lower pleasures. But setting that aside, I feel like Mill has this kind of profound realization, that a certain way of thinking is just inadequate to what it means to lead a full human life.
Yeah, there's this great story, and I can't remember the author of the book, and I read that book also about the doctor who realized he had a relatively short time to live, and he was contemplating having a baby, right? And his wife said, "Well, isn't that going to make dying all the more difficult?" And he said, "Well, wouldn't that be a good thing?"
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. It's a great book called When Breath Becomes Air by Paul Kalanithi, I believe is the name. But yeah, exactly. That he's this very talented, brilliant doctor who dies. I can't remember. He's pretty young, I think in his 30s. But he himself gets cancer and dies. But they decide to have a child before he dies. And as you nicely put it, like the question is in some sense, is this going to make your life harder? And it's like, yeah, it will make my life harder. And that's a great thing. To feel that grief is a good thing for me. And because it means I'm feeling grief about new life that I'm missing out on. And that's a pain worth having, so to speak, because of the deeper meaning that's registered. And again, that, both the Mill story and that story, I mean, they speak to this idea that there are higher values that sometimes, involve suffering as part of them, but that our lives are just so much richer for having than if we deny ourselves that simply to make life easy.
Well, of course, you have a whole chapter on Nietzsche, who is, probably most famous for his quote, "If it doesn't kill me, it makes me stronger." And he does seem to be the great anti-utilitarian of our time, right?
Yeah, and to me, I think of utilitarianism as representing one kind of extreme of modernity, where it's like we're going to solve all of our problems technologically, basically. And Nietzsche represents kind of the polar opposite extreme, where he in a sense really wants to embrace suffering, not just having to endure it, but even inflicting it up to a point that he just thinks, look, we're part of nature. Nature is red in tooth and claw. This is a scene of struggle and strife. That's what makes us feel alive. And so, we've just got to do that. And that too is a position that can easily be kind of parodied or taken to ugly extremes. And Nietzsche himself likes to tease us sometimes with those ugly extremes. But I do think even here there's a kind of interesting wisdom that Nietzsche has that's quite powerful, which is that, and this came up with the prisoners too, because Nietzsche too talks about things like incarceration and punishment. And Nietzsche's point isn't like, oh, we shouldn't incarcerate people because we should be nice to them or we need to be kind to them. But what Nietzsche says is that we all have these desires for sort of inflicting punishment. But when we deny ourselves that we have these desires, we actually can weirdly become crueler than when we just discharge them naturally. And Nietzsche uses things like incarceration as an example of this. He sees that the rise of Christianity as having a totally new way of relating to people's crimes, that in one sense they have the good-hearted view, according to Nietzsche, or at least they think they have this good-hearted view of saying, we want to, so to speak, rehabilitate you, or to put it in the early terms of the Christians, we want to make you penitent for your sins, hence the term penitentiary. And so we're going to put you in a cell like a monk, and you will learn to be penitent for your sins. But now what do? We sort of for their own good, are locking them away from people for years or their whole lives, and yet we're somehow telling ourselves that we're doing that out of good impulses. And Nietzsche's like, in many ways, isn't that crueler than just like cutting off their finger and letting them go back to their lives, after we've discharged our anger at them? And certainly the prisoners found this idea very sympathetic, that many of them found the idea that they were being rehabilitated, or that the point of this was to, the prison was to make them into better people, just laughable. They saw it as, a big kind of fundamental pain being inflicted on them by society. And, maybe they deserved it or not or whatever, but to be kind of moralized about what they were going through seemed to them a kind of hypocrisy, and maybe a hypocrisy that actually weirdly made the world crueler than less cruel. In the name of somehow being nice, that we are actually being much crueler. And I think that so I do think there's an interesting idea that we all have to grapple with a bit, which is, when we tell ourselves, we're doing things for other people's own good, is that always true, or are there motives to inflict pain on others that are often within those motives? So while I don't want to go all the way with Nietzsche either, I do find that there's some real interesting wisdom that he has about what it means to embrace a certain amount of the fact that suffering is not just what I have to endure, but suffering is also something I inflict. And rather than think, I'm just going to try to never inflict suffering and only be good to people, to think instead of, what does it mean to do this in ways that are more honest or more open overall? It's a challenging question.
Yeah. Well, you can't write a book on pointless suffering without talking about Job, right? He's like the patron saint of of pointless suffering, and I think the story of Job is one that I don't know anyone that isn't somewhat confused by it, right? Because it doesn't seem to fit neatly in with any of our notions of religion, whether it's Old Testament or New Testament. But how do we make sense of the story of Job?
Oh boy, that's a tough one. I will say, just as a preface to the answering that when I was teaching in the prison, I kind of wrote up a version of the Book of Job, and we performed it in the prison, kind of a reader's theater version of the Book of Job, which was quite interesting and charming, and then had a discussion of it afterwards. But yeah, I mean, for one, it's very possible that the Book of Job was kind of composed over many periods and gets kind of mishmashed together, so it's hard to know if there's an underlying unity. But there is something about the text that is just so compelling. For one, it's just magnificent poetry. But there's several things that I think of as really important that need to be emphasized about the Book of Job. One is that it is a kind of holy text that is very much opposed to what we were talking about at the beginning of our conversation, that, God has a plan, it all works out, in many ways, that is roundly scorned over the course of the Book of Job. Job is suffering these kinds of terrible afflictions. His children die, he loses his land, he suffers a terrible skin disease, he's in all sorts of pain. And his friends come to him, and to their credit, they just sit with him for a while, which I give them a lot of credit for that, because I think that that's probably about the best you can do to the Jobs of the world, is just be with them through their suffering. But then they start opening their mouths, and then they start saying versions of, well, you must have done something to deserve this. Like God wouldn't just do this, and Job is quite insistent that he has not done anything to deserve this. And he's speaking, I think, for humankind here. Like, there are times maybe when you smoke your whole life and then you die of lung cancer, and maybe we can say, well, you kind of brought it on yourself there. You knew smoking was bad and you did it anyway, and now you got to pay the price. But what about the kid who dies of lung cancer? Well, wait a second. That is, maybe the kid did some stuff wrong. Maybe he disobeyed his teacher at school, but it's like, come on, like lung cancer is the punishment? Like, no way. That just doesn't add up.
Maybe the world is just a rough draft. It's
right.
Right.
Well, that's Hume's view.
Yeah.
Hume makes that joke that this is like a bad version of God's creation. But when God finally shows up at the end of the book of Job, he makes it clear that Job's friends who are trying to claim that Job did something wrong were themselves wrong to have said that, and that Job was right, and that in many ways that God also sort of gives Job credit for asking honest questions, for saying, why me, rather than turning to kind of bogus justifications for things. I find that to be a great lesson in some sense, that we're better off asking honest questions, even if they're difficult, than settling into easy answers just for the sake of trying to make the world make sense to us. But I do wonder if there's just not something of the fact that the book of Job registers that God is always going to kind of blow our minds, that the concept of God, if it's not blowing our minds, it's not really the concept of God, so to speak. That we can't, if you have a God who's just makes total sense, it's sort of like ceases to be a God. Like there's something about the divine that opens us to deep mystery, and I'm inclined to think that that's true. That. And I don't think we can avoid it. I mean, I know that a lot of people feel like the problem of evil, the problem of Job, disproves God. But I'm not so sure that that's true. I have a hunch that we just can't get away from the problem. That even if we say, okay, no God, well, we still have to face ourselves and deal with these same questions about suffering, and we find mysteries there too. In other words, there's mysteries wherever we can run, but we can't hide from the mystery, so to speak, there. And so, to me, a religion that can incorporate that sense of that mystery is going to be a much more powerful kind of thing for people than one that tries to smooth it away, that one that tries to, like Job's comforters, just to sort of make it seem like, oh, no, don't worry, it all adds up in the end. I think insisting on it's not adding up, there's something powerful about that. It's still troubling. It's not. This is the problem. This is that there's not easy.
Well, I mean, I think that the point is that pointless suffering has its own point. I mean, if all the suffering had a point, if we could understand it, explain it away, figure out what caused it, figure out why it's there, then there would be no mystery, right? And so it's precisely the pointless suffering that bedevils us, right? That makes us stand back in awe and ask these questions, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that there's a kind of flip side to this too, which is that there's pointless suffering, but there's also, so to speak, pointless joy, or joy itself has an element of pointlessness as well. And weirdly, these two things can
no one questions that. No one worries about that one too much.
Right. But I mean, if you had a world where I sometimes think about this, like in terms, like I've a few times I've gotten massages in my life, and the like sometimes the masseuse who's good will like put you in a certain amount of pain, but then it like always pays off into a great pleasure. You're like, oh, that feels so good. And you could imagine a world, so to speak, like that, where like there was a little bit of pain, but like it always like made sense in the end. And like, you're just like, oh, thank goodness that was just right. But I'm not so sure that would be a world with joy in it. It would have pleasure in it, and it might even have a nice pleasure in it. But I'm not so sure it would have this other thing, which is that just as there are mysteries that blow our minds negatively, that there are mysteries that blow our minds positively and kind of bring in something too. I think we need, there's got to be this backdrop of mystery that has both positive and negative dimensions. And it seems to me that when we think about, this brings us back to the humanities and the arts. When we think about really powerful art or stories or philosophy, they weirdly incorporate tragedy in them, and yet there's something joyful about engaging with them. Like, I love the blues, and the blues is to me very much like this, that it is a music of sorrow and tragedy in some sense, and it's a joyful music. It's a music that is full of a kind of life-affirming spirit at the very same time that it registers pain. And it's not that it makes them, it's not like the massage where all the pain makes sense in the end.
Yeah.
It's, the pain is there, it's terrible, and yet we're still dancing. And there's something, to me, powerful about that. And I feel like we see that in Greek tragedy, we see it in Shakespeare, we see it in great religions, we see it in the most powerful kind of music, and we see it in the best kinds of philosophers, that they're wrestling with this, and somehow in wrestling with it, as troubling as it is, there's something that kind of gives us a jolt of joy or of humanity.
Yeah, I think your daughter, when she was 5 years old, asked a very a very deep question.
Yeah.
Right, which is, well, okay, if the blues came out of slavery, then does that mean slavery was a good thing?
Yeah. I mean, because I listened to a lot of blues and blues-influenced music, and so my kids, grew up around it, and they knew how much I loved it, and they loved it too, and still do. And, and at some point they're asking me about it, and I'm giving them kind of a potted historical lesson and the sorrow songs of the slaves and Jim Crow and all this stuff. But then my daughter asked the question, well, okay, so if this great thing came out of it, was slavery good? Well, of course not. I mean, no, and there is no redeeming the kind of horror of slavery, not even close. But we don't even, slavery is just the most dramatic kind of terrible thing that we can think about. We can just even go into our own lives. Like, you think about the loss of loved ones. There's not a clear-cut redemption of this. Or to go back to the book of Job, one of the things that I've always found a bit offensive in the book of Job is that God kind of rewards Job at the end by giving him new children.
Yeah. Happy ending.
Yeah. And so it's like, okay, all the other ones died, but here are new children, they were even better looking and smarter than the ones who died.
Do you think they just added that on? You know how they used to in the 19th century have a happy ending to King Lear, where Cordelia and the king go off into the sunset.
Right. The Hollywood ending here of Book of Job. Yeah, maybe there is something to that, but to me that's a kind of an offensive thing to think that. Having new children for Job is, I'm sure, a wonderful thing, but it does not make up for the loss of his previous children, not in any way, even if they're better looking and smarter kids. Like there's not going to be a redemption of that, and certainly not of slavery. And yet, this is the world we live in. The blues is a great music. It is a testament to the human spirit. It is, something that we should treasure, and it is inseparable from the legacy of slavery. And that's now we're back to the mind being blown in the face of it. But this is, to me, just what it means to wrestle with stuff. To want to run away from that is to lose something important about both our ability to tell our own histories, but also just our ability to face what it means to be human.
Well, you talk about temperament, and I think you're implicitly saying that there is a philosophical temperament or disposition which requires you to confront and face things. And, you provide examples of how we will shunt suffering off into concealed spaces, right? We'll take our sick people and put them in a box, and all of our demented people, and pack them away and have our funerals behind closed doors. But then also that sort of sleepwalking leads to an abdication of responsibility. So in the Hannah Arendt chapter, you talk about the company man and how people are living these sort of dead lives. What's the connection there? Is there, by pushing away the suffering, by failing to confront suffering, how does that tie in with responsibility?
Yeah.
And confrontation with with the truth.
Yeah, I find Hannah Arendt just very sharp about this stuff. And she has her very famous phrase, "the banality of evil," to describe what call it the company man who's just sort of following orders. But in a sense, to me, her most important point is that the banality of evil is bound up with what she calls thoughtlessness, and that I think we're all given to at some level, and so it's important to kind of remember. And thoughtlessness doesn't mean like being dumb. It doesn't mean even not thought. You can have thoughts going on in your head, so to speak, and still be thoughtless. To me, it's a kind of shutting off a certain part of our ability to think about the world. So if we take the kind of company man in the Holocaust, the typical Nazi foot soldier or something, the thoughtlessness might express itself by, the Nazi saying, "Look, I just load him onto the train. Like, I was trying to be nice to him, getting him on the train. Like, that was what I was supposed to do. That was my job. They're just on the train. I closed the door." And then if you say, "Yeah, but you know where they're going," "I don't want to think about it." Like, don't even, or I've known lots of people who work, in what they consider to be ugly corporations. And when you start bringing up, like all this terrible stuff the corporation does, they're like, "I don't want to think about it. Like, I just go to work, do my thing," And yet it's a bunch of people doing that are that's adding up to the horrible thing. And that's the kind of turning off, part of our brain, just rather than confront what's going on. But it can happen even at the higher levels. It's not just the Nazi foot soldier or the company man, but even, she's talking about Eichmann, who is a fairly high up person in the Nazi chain of things. But she's struck by, at the end of the day, he still just wants to have a Führer, and he wants to be, guided by the Führer, and whatever the Führer says is what's right. And he's got Kantian justifications for it. But she's just like, this guy is just not thinking. He's just not confronting it. There's a mediocrity in his ability to face what's going on. And she just disdains that. And she's not saying he needs to be more of an intellectual or something like that. She's just saying, look, there are people who just think about this stuff. And once they do, it becomes much harder to live with doing it, whereas when you turn off your thoughtfulness about this stuff, yeah, you can kind of just skate along and try to avoid thinking about it as much as possible. And I think that that's a challenge for all of us, that we're all challenged a bit with like trying to kind of just turn off the thoughtfulness about the relationship to the world. In my book, I say that there's like kind of a fix it attitude and a face it attitude, but I also say there's another one: forget about it, just ignore it. And I think, to me, actually, a healthy life involves all of these attitudes. Like, sometimes you have to forget about it. You just need to be like, okay, I'm turning off the news. I'm going to pour myself a glass of wine. I'm just going to, relax or whatever. But if all you're doing is forgetting about it, turning it off, not thinking, then we run the risk also of not just dehumanizing ourselves, but participating in tremendous evil thoughtlessly, and telling ourselves that, well, I'm just doing my job.
Well, speaking of pouring a glass of wine, I got to hear about this new book of food. You worked, I worked in kitchens, you worked in kitchens, and food is a big part of my life. And so I'm wondering, what do you have to say in this new book?
Yeah, I worked for a long time, in particular, for this really unique restaurant, a kind of early farm-to-table restaurant that was kind of in the middle of the Iowa countryside, a really beautiful, lovely spot. And I had a chance to be kind of a sous chef there for a long time. Part of it was my wife was saying, after the Suffering book, she was like, now you need a joy book, and so I wrote a Rome book, which was part of that. But then I was like, my real joy book is cooking and thinking about cooking. But that book is called, it's going to come out probably in the fall, and it's called To Taste on Cooking and the Good Life. And it explores a lot of different things, but it really kind of dawns on me that I'm of the mind that part of what a philosophical life is about is living a good day, is making the most of the time that we have. And the fact is that our days are structured in part by meals, as are our weeks and our seasons. And so part of what it means to have a good day is to think about what we're eating and with whom we're eating and how are we eating. And I think that it provides a kind of context for thinking about a more active engagement with the world, a more engaged way of relating to the world. So many people
So no Soylent for you.
No, I'm not a Soylent Green kind of guy. But so many people live such kind of mediated lives, and while there are many ways of breaking out of that, it seems to me that having a relationship with what we can't but have an unmediated relationship to, namely putting something in our mouth, that can be a way of exploring what it means to live well. And I actually think that the more I've thought about things like cooking and eating, the more I've seen just how much it informs so many things around us, so much of human history, so much of the metaphors of how we think, all kind of go back to the table. So it's a wide-ranging exploration of the people I've really loved and the times we've eaten together, and what it means to kind of think about cooking and sharing food, and what we can learn about how to live a good life in relationship to those things.
Yeah, I've always thought that it was a metaphor for how you lived your whole life, right? I mean, there's mindless eating, and there's thoughtful and mindful eating, and who you do it with and how you do it is probably you can learn a lot about somebody, right? About how they live in general by looking at how they engage food.
Yeah.
So I look forward to this book.
Great. Well, maybe we can have another conversation after it comes out.
Indeed. And maybe we can cook a meal together sometime.
Well, that would be even better.
Yeah. So if you come to the Bay Area, let's do it.
Okay. Sounds good.
Scott, thanks so much for joining me. We didn't even get to talk about Rome as a guide to the good life, but check this one out. And then also The Deepest Human Life, fantastic book, along with 7 ways of looking at pointless suffering. Thanks so much.
Hey, it's been great being here and having this conversation. I love this kind of thing.
Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.